So do you want to start? I mean, in a sense, you were the one who came up with this theme of questioning. And so what does that mean to you? And it's obviously an extremely broad topic, but I think you probably have some place that you're thinking about starting.
Well, I thought that one possible question to consider um, is how you can answer the question, or how you can sell the idea to people, like why they should question anything, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think it seems apparent to me, at least, that most people, they don't question anything, like where in any kind of significant way. And that, for those of us that do, that then raises the question, well, why not?
Mm-hmm.
So there's two questions. Why don't they? Well, maybe there are three. Why don't they? Why do we? And if we're trying to say to anyone that isn't currently questioning things very much, we have to sort of think what we can say to them about, like, why they ought to do it. And then the rest of it, like what they question and in what way, like how and where, which sources, and, you know, when, how frequently, and when not to, and so forth, that comes later. So I don't think that really we can address the question of why we question things and some others don't, and how we would try to get them to begin. I don't think there's any way to separate those three questions. I think they all go together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of the way that Nietzsche started off Beyond Good and Evil, which was probably the first really seriously intellectual book I'd read, with just interrogating this idea of why seek for the truth at all, and is it actually a given that the truth serves life better than illusion? And in that way, of course, he was very much trying to overturn and interrogate the Western tradition that, since Socrates and Plato, even really before, since Heraclitus and possibly before that, had just taken for granted that the line, the unexamined life is not worth living, and that the truth is something that inherently enhances life. And that is my view, which it was not always, which we'll get into later, I guess. But it is something that I think needs to be defended in a certain way, because when life is difficult enough, trying to make your way in the economy, trying to take care of your family, trying to have real friendships, real relationships, and then having a bit of time to relax, why bother? And that's been a struggle for me in the way that you described, that it's trying to get people to be concerned with these issues, be they political, philosophical, or spiritual, is often a struggle. And obviously doing this kind of show where you're putting something like this online, one has to say, one, why do we care? And two, why do we feel the need to bother others? And I think for a long time, for me, the first and most obvious answer to that was the fact that we are living now in a culture where not only nation states, but even the deeper structures, the deep states or deep state, however you want to call it, is so powerful and so, from my point of view, reckless, that we've reached a point where these are not merely entities that are parasitizing us and screwing up our lives, but that they have the potential to really wreck the entire fabric of life and wreck the biosphere, and that it feels, to begin with, this is the first thing I would put out there, that there's some moral obligation at this point to not only to be true to oneself, but to show compassion toward life in general, that there's a kind of moral obligation to do this kind of questioning. So I guess that would be the first thing I would say about it.
That's interesting, especially using the word obligation, as in because you're a part of some interconnected whole, and like an existential, this is like an existential threat to that which you're connected with, or?
Yeah, I think there's that. I think you can look at it almost at every tier of organization. So, I mean, just to be true to myself, to not allow these sort of parasitic brutes to, there's only so much one person can do, obviously, and I'm making compromises all the time, all day long, but to not compromise completely, to at least point out what is happening and try to extricate myself from these parasitic bonds as much as I can, which I'm doing in various ways. So there, being true to myself, growing up, again, I guess we'll get into our personal stories later, but just seeing how my family was very much negatively impacted by larger cultural and social forces, and saying, okay, well, why is this happening? And then, going outward to humans in general, to the broader culture, which, there's so many things I dislike about America for sure, but there are some good things about Western culture and American culture that are being eroded. And first and foremost being freedom of speech, and then to the larger human fabric, and then the larger biosphere. All of this is sort of under assault by essentially lies, exploitation, physical domination, and this constant weaving of illusions that the power elite do. And there's just a kind of offense. And I did use obligation. We'll get into, I guess, morality at some point on this show. But I would say some sort of there's something to do with an ethical call, and then a kind of existential authenticity to, among other things, try to work through the illusions and lies and point them out to whomever will listen.
Yeah, I really like everything that you've just said. I think that I'm getting a sense from you of a similar kind of conception that I have, in that truth in some ways is something that we need and we use. And you've touched on the idea of, especially for people of our age and in our sort of walks of life, it's a kind of bastion against further sort of deformation of life and culture. And I think you've also touched on there how those avenues by which people discover truth for themselves and see things as they are is something that's come under direct assault by people that want to control other people. So they've always tried to control those conduits, if you like, from when the Catholic Church was making it illegal to translate the Bible from Latin into other languages. I think in some jurisdictions for a time it was actually illegal for families to possess their own copy of the Bible, and it was only there for the pulpit to be put across and so forth. So there's a long tradition of this kind of this way of doing things. In my own field of linguistics, There's innumerable case studies of where language has been used directly to for reasons of power, and the elimination of languages. Just as a little aside, and perhaps we'll edit this out, perhaps we won't, but I did some research recently for a presentation in one of my seminars, and I found an interesting statistic that the median number of speakers for all the languages in the world is 6,000. Okay, which we would think of as minute.
Yeah.
Right? Probably more people live in like one of the small towns surrounding you than that, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, the more that the big languages become dominant, and there's obviously socioeconomic and cultural factors why more people are learning English and these other languages are disappearing. And I thought, well, with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that kind of proves that the structure of the language you're using actually changes the way that you think and therefore your approach to the world. Inside of our linguistic group, this thing is happening in microcosm with the disappearance of whole phrases, and how the media are saying 1 minute it's a climate crisis. Apparently, we're on the cusp of them changing it to something even more existential sounding to try to drive a particular agenda, and then all the political correctness stuff, it changes things. And I worry, like the generation that follow us, will they know these concepts unless there are people like us around to transmit them and pass them on? It's quite scary.
It's very scary. It's very scary to, whenever the multi-generational issue comes up, it makes me tremble a bit to think just how strategically and logistically overmatched we are, where most people I know who are really trying to question or resist things in any way, they're trying to, keep their lives together while doing one or more projects that are pushing back against what's happening, and they're thinking a few years ahead. They may or may not be having children at all, or thinking about the next generation at all, and meanwhile we're facing these people who are probably thinking on the scale of centuries of how to crush us. So it's overwhelming, and I don't mean to throw in some big downer, but that is what it makes me think about. So there are a couple things in there with what you said. I guess I want to I want to touch on one thing you were saying about the capacities with which going off of what I just said, that it was only, I think it was right around the mid 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, was the first point at which the majority of the world actually fell under the jurisdiction of nation states. And before that, I think it was the mid 19th century, it might have been the early 19th century. Before that, it was actually more than 50% of the landmass was only controlled by sort of smaller power centers, or not really controlled by much of anything. And you appreciate how recent that is. And so I think that is something that makes this time period very unusual, that you could, at that time, I mean, we think of these big empires like the Roman Empire or the Mongolian Empire. Yes, they had a lot of control in the sense that they could bring down a level of force that no non-state force could, but it was pretty easy still to just live in the cracks, or to just leave or go into uncontrolled territory. There were always these runaway communities of different kinds, like Maroons and Quilombos and all that kind of stuff. And there was a certain centralization of information in that there was just, not as much media in general, but still at that time, most people got their information through informal networks or whatever clan or that sort of thing they belonged to. And it's only in this past century and a half to 2 centuries that almost everything is controlled. And that's what I think makes media different now, is that if there's no place you can go to, and there are people that still live in the cracks. I don't mean to put down on that. And that's actually something I would like to talk about at some point in the future in the show. But it's much harder to live in the cracks. And that, I guess, is also something that's pushing me to do this show in particular, is just seeing how the clamp on free speech, the censorship, is coming so hard now. And I think it makes it different logistically, different existentially, in the sense of there's less and less room to maneuver to speak out against power elite now than at any point, even in the recent past. It took a long time to make a small point, but I think. No,
I think you made it very. I think you made it very well, and what you were showing was this kind of this exponential speeding up of things. And when you were talking about the nation state idea, I was thinking, okay, well, yeah. So the Treaty of Westphalia, I think 1648.
It's right around there. I don't know.
All right. So that is more recent than the King James Bible, which I think we tend to think of as like a very modern document, and more modern than Shakespeare and things like that. And then when you were talking about empires and how people could kind of venture off a bit more, then I moved on to thinking about the example of San Marino, right? So they were the first nation state. They didn't think of themselves in those terms, but they had this existence since, I think, around about 300 AD, where they just basically left the Roman Empire and said, they were monks mainly. They were like, we're just going to go over here and do our thing. And then they did, and the Roman Empire left them alone. And I think what you've also touched on there is that all those previous empires, they were more concerned with stuff and basically resources and wealth and some slavery and things like that. But those technological elements, printing presses and later, wire cables and other things like that, have just allowed for more and more control of information, and therefore a suppression of what might be questioned. And it's interesting that there's this dialectic between when you impose this new modernity, whatever the feature of it might be, there's going to be a reaction against that. So that they sometimes anticipate it or sometimes react to that by then further suppressing the information available about it, or putting some positive propaganda like fluoride, it's good for your teeth. It's not a byproduct of the aluminium industry. Don't listen to that. It's good for your teeth. So yeah, it's something that's picking up pace more and more that time goes on, really.
Yeah, I like how you're already sort of dropping these nuggets of tinfoil posting type stuff, but we can get into all that later. We can get into all that later.
And even at this early stage, I would say nothing that I would do, even if I were just to drop it in like that, everything that I say in that regard is can be backed up with multiple reams of evidence.
Yeah, I guess I'll take an opportunity at this point to say one of the things that you and I have, just to tell the audience, that you and I have talked about behind the scenes, has been that one of us may introduce a topic that the other one may or may not know about, may or may not agree with, and then we'll sort of do a dialogical format where one of us plays the questioner and then the other one gets to make the points that they want to make. And then I also want to.
That's very good, isn't it? Actually, like that is the questioning process can be done at the individual level, and then most naturally in a dialogue between two people. that is a very good way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, something I really want to do with the show, most online media and most print media, most television media, whatever their quality, some better than others, obviously, tend to really push a particular ideological viewpoint. And something I want this to really be more of a forum. And you and I agree about a lot of things. We don't agree about everything. And then I would like to bring guests on, and I really want to talk to whomever, and not have this be a place that promulgates ideology, but a place that fosters questioning and dialogue. And obviously, I have my own viewpoints. I'm not going to hide them, and I am going to push my own viewpoint. But I don't want the show as a whole to have that kind of bend. Yeah, so you were talking about states in the past, proto-states or early states were more like protection rackets, wealth accrual systems, and it's unbelievable what people put up with now that would have been unthinkable to someone living in Carthage or Phoenicia, or where essentially there was some kind of politician, some kind of political unit, which might be priests, some kind of royal family, something like that. They taxed you, they'd conscript you at certain times, but to have what we have now with these permanent standing armies, these people
they weren't social engineers. That's the difference.
They weren't social engineers, right? The idea that in we see now all the time in England, where the police are contacting people for things that they post on social media, and then they say, why are you contacting me? What crime did I commit? Oh, you didn't commit a crime. We're just checking in on you because we see what you're posting. Or there was a family I visited in Germany where the police visited them because there had been a crime committed in the area, and the police noticed that they didn't have Facebook, and they literally said, "We noticed you didn't have Facebook, and we just think that's very suspicious that you're not on there." And they had no reason to think that they were involved in this crime or anything. It's just unbelievable stuff. So yeah, so at times like this, I think it's more important than ever to speak out and speak to those who are interested when it does feel like the room for that is getting more and more narrow. So
yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to get into that refer to some of the stuff you've been saying. When you talked about the differences that you and I had and the dialogue that we've had about different issues, I think that comes into how our individual ways of thinking differ, and they're obviously by extension other people's as well. So like maybe you can say a little bit about I think we talked about why people should question things, and we've given the viewers a litany of examples of ways in which that can be useful and so forth and important. In terms of what,
right.
How do you select what you consider to be a reliable source? Like you've begun to question something, and let's take say state power in general, or abuse of state power in the place that you live, and you think you're alarmed on maybe an emotional or an intuitive level, and you start to question it. How do you go about selecting what sources you're going to use for that questioning process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are many dimensions to it. I would say one dimension is trying to, insofar as it's possible, sometimes it's very possible, sometimes it's not, make inferences as to what the motivations and character of the person or group presenting the thesis are. What is their history? What seems to be their goal? Do they seem to be authentically concerned with human liberation? What are their biases? What is their logistical support? Who's funding them? Do they seem to be, how are they received by the organs of authority? Are they sort of court historians, court intellectuals, or are they people who seem authentically committed to truth? Are they condemned for are they condemned by the official organs of power for what seems to be the truth? What kind of research do they do? Do they go to primary sources? If someone's doing history, have they done the groundwork of cataloging and combing through primary source material, or do they rely on secondary sources, and therefore do they regurgitate what might be falsehoods, whether intentionally or unintentionally? What is someone's real philosophical process? How much do they adhere to logic and authentic forms of evidence versus are they prone to fallacies? Are they prone to ad hominem? Are they prone to guilt by association when they critique others? To
concretize that a little bit,
sure.
Why don't you give me an example, or give us an example of a source which may have originally seemed valid to you that you later found some reason to reject, and then the contrary, something that initially you were like, no way, this is harebrained, and then on closer inspection you then took that source to be more valid, or possibly even utterly correct.
Yeah, I guess in the former case, when I was a teenager, Noam Chomsky had a big influence on me, and I thought that he was this ultra-radical figure because he was saying things about U.S. imperialism and talking about what he called anarchism. And these were things that were completely new to me, that I hadn't heard anywhere. And when I looked into claims that he was making about U.S. foreign policy being motivated by, say, corporate predation and that sort of stuff, when I started to look into it, I thought, wow, he's really right. And I thought very highly of him for, I don't know, probably a couple of years. And then I remember reading his book, Chomsky on Anarchism, which is just a collection of essays of his. And the whole way the book was framed was, we all know what Noam Chomsky is. I think this is even almost verbatim what the jacket on the book says. Something, we all know what Chomsky is against, but what is he really for? And I read I read the book, and it says almost nothing very specific or useful about what he actually thinks of as anarchism. And then you say, okay, well, actually, his anarchism does just seem like, democratic
communism.
Well, I would just say sort of like puffed up democratic socialism, and clearly would still be a state by another name. And then I, the more I thought about it, I'm like, okay, this guy's, an MIT academic, and he's Not that everything he says is bullshit. I'm not saying that, but he is not. When push comes to shove, he just sort of endorses a broad left position, and there's nothing terribly exciting about him. And I actually think he probably overall does more harm than good to the ideas of anarchism. And I do consider myself an anarchist, and we can talk about that at some point, because I know you have issues with that term. So I think that would be a good example of the former. As far as the latter, nothing leaps to mind at the moment. I would have to think about it.
Well, perhaps I can jump in and give
please.
the example of a source of questioning that most people would reject out of hand. Okay, so if you say to them, "Have you read Industrial Society and Its Future?"
Right, sure.
They'd say, "I've never heard of it." You say, "Well, it's a pamphlet or short treatise written by Ted Kaczynski," and then they're like, "Well, who's that?" And you say, "Well, he was kind of known in the media based on his crimes as the Unabomber." You've lost them at that point.
Yeah, totally.
They're not going to read it, and if they do, like, they've got this emotional subtext going through their mind all the time of, well, this guy killed people, and he tried to kill more, and he's crazy, and he lived in a hut in the woods, blah blah blah. Then the source is kind of they've discredited it. Mm-hmm. Funnily enough, by kind of by their conditioning, by the what we were talking about before, how living in these conditions with these power mongers, they push across this very kind of programming to get people to just go, "Oh, well, that must be nonsense then." But if I do not approve of or condone Kaczynski's crimes in any way, mm-hmm. but as a piece of questioning, mm-hmm. there is some parts of that essay or treatise that are interesting, and you should read, even if it was all something, even if I disagreed with 100% of it, rather than sort of half of it or the majority of it or something like that. You'd then be still better off to have read it and considered it. That you'd have gone through a process of questioning, even if you ultimately decide, no, this is wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of the latter case that you were talking about. I read that essay the first time when I was about 22. And at the time I was reading it, I felt, somewhat scandalous even reading it. I wouldn't feel that way about something now, but I was still fairly naive at that time. And when I have tried to speak to most people about just saying, even if it just comes up and I wasn't even the one to bring it up, saying something like, well, have you ever read it? And the idea that there's some sort of spiritual contagion about even saying something like that is even among people that I consider to be intelligent people, thoughtful people, still there's a sort of bridge too far in so many cases. And you were asking about evaluating sources. Well, if you pick up something like that, you think, okay, well, this guy, what do I know about him? He was basically a sort of outcast and loner for many years before, outcast by choice, really, for many years before writing this or while writing it. And we know that he wanted to start a kind of, semi-Leninist style revolution against industrial society that he thought would produce enormous death, but ultimately liberate people from a worse fate in the long run. So you basically know his agenda, and you can evaluate the writing in that context. There's not some sort of concern that he's, working for, like, secretly working for the CIA or something like that, right? So, or that he's funded by some think tank. Like, we know that we have strong confidence that he's speaking authentically about what he thinks. So that's how you evaluate the source. And you know that he wants to lead you to acts of violence. Like, that's his agenda. He wants to lead you to acts of violence against industrial society. So we can read it in that context. And I think that sort of exercise is what we should be doing every time we encounter a piece of media that makes us think or question or has any real chance of being anything other than like, oh, this is just the usual bullshit. We should always be doing that exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't want it to become too much of a sort of unidirectional questioning at this point. And
yeah, sure.
The final things that I want to touch on would be in the way of posing a question to you to see what you've got to say about it. So maybe at this stage, if you have anything that you want to now change the tack a little bit. Yeah?
I guess you didn't tell me why you think there. I actually did kick the question to you at the beginning, but you didn't go into so much detail about why do you think there is value in questioning these dominant narratives, and what does it do for you in your life? And obviously it's something you've been doing for a long time. So I guess it's a two-part question. Why do you feel the need to question?
I think in terms of like why and what drives me to question, I think that's definitely best covered with the thoughts that I've prepared for the second stage, I think.
Sure.
I think that when we move on to the second episode, we can definitely get into that in more details from both of us. I think in terms of what it gives in my life. So increasingly, I've not seen philosophy and life as being separable, and I've come to see that the process of thinking about thinking, and especially thinking about my thinking, is a kind of a sort of feedback loop inside of my life to help me make choices. Okay, so as someone that believes in free will and the centrality of making choices in determining the path of one's life,
mm-hmm.
the more information I have, the better informed I am. Okay, mm-hmm. And if you take a single concept like, say, sex, which is, an important part of many people's lives, even in the case of those people who are not having very much sex. But how one relates that one concept, that one idea in one's life will largely determine how one approaches that, how one engages in it. And so if you're not thinking at all, then you're just kind of carrying out these activities driven probably by animal drives mixed with strange messages in the entertainment media, which kind of, let's face it, try to kind of eroticize everything and get people screwing all the time so that they feel distracted from anything else. But if you're someone that's thought about it, spent any amount of time thinking about it, then it can actually enrich the sex that you have, B, kind of help shield you from some of the risks involved, and C, if you have children, you could then think about how you want them to navigate this topic within the course of their own lives, and it will affect the way that you bring them up, and also as well when you interact with friends, what advice you give, and so forth. This is just really the first topic that came to my mind. But you have this this potential there to, through examination, actually bring about clearer choices, perhaps better choices. And I think this is one of the reasons why I've kind of gone like to a 180 swing in my life, from early on being very libertine and thinking that the idea of no sex before marriage was a crazy idea, to ending up in a situation where, having through the course of my life explored sex physically and intellectually from a number of different angles, comes to the conclusion that I think waiting until you're married before you have sex with someone is probably a very, very good idea, and not just for sort of doctrinal reasons, but because of something deeper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It might be an odd choice of concept, but I couldn't think of a better one more immediately. And family, how you view your family, how you view the state, all of this thinking affects the way that you live your life.
Yeah, there was something in there that you said about philosophy being inseparable from life, and yeah, after, we'll get into this in the next episode, but after having been very much an existentialist, almost to the point of nihilist for most of my adult life, I've actually come around to very much embracing the Platonic and Neoplatonic idea that this sort of questioning and search for truth is very much at the heart of the meaning of life, and that the true is inevitably tied up with the good and the beautiful, and there is nothing that it makes more sense to pursue. So I really resonate with that. But I do want to then ask, on this theme of questioning, is there anything that ought not to be questioned? Is questioning and speculation, interrogation, is it ever immoral? Are there things that are sacred, as we say, that should not be questioned or touched? Or is everything and anything up for examination?
Like in a broad moral sense, I don't think there's anything that should not be questioned. I think that in almost every context I can think, well, in all the contexts I can think of, in every form of questioning that one might engage in, I see that even if this is like no change in your thinking, you spent some time thinking about whether or not there needed to be a change in thinking, or whether there was anything there that you might want to reconsider. I think in a kind of there is a sense in which if a person is beginning to question certain things, it would make me feel that would be possibly moving in the direction of nihilism, because you could kind of say, well, is there really anything sacred about life? Should we not just take harvest a load of embryos and do experiments on them to try to, make medical progress? Is there really anything? Is there nothing sacred about the human spirit and the human being? Should we just install machine parts into ourselves and push for full transhumanism? You could see that as a kind of questioning. The transhumanist movement probably would defend themselves along lines of saying, well, we're just questioning all these, do we really need to be physical beings and all this kind of stuff? So is there something immoral in that? Not really. I think it's more pathological. It's like, then it brings in the whole idea, which you and I have talked about a lot, of meta philosophy. Well, why are you asking that question? It can't, at that stage, it can't just be pure curiosity. There has to be something else there that is driving that, and it's probably quite related to trauma in many cases, and a sort of a breakdown in natural fulfillments and functions and things like that. But I think in general, for something that I would like to try and convey to anyone that's listening to this, it's like, think about any aspect of your life that you think is good or bad, and if you were to spend a few minutes, hours, days, or months just giving it some thought, is there any bad that might come out of that? Like, societally, yes. Like, you can put a target on your head by questioning the wrong things at the wrong time. And I think that that's something we'll touch on in time. Like, we're not advocating people to kind of become questioning absolutists.
Yeah, sure.
And to always think, well, is this in my best interests? But generally speaking, no. I don't think there's anything I can think of that is off limits.
We're going to try to do a lot of different things with this show. I have really high expectations for it, and this is just a trial run. And we really want to have discourse and dialogue with the audience. We really want to bring on guests. We really want to pursue topics that the audience is interested in. So I hope people will contact us. And
I think I would agree with all of that and say that, to be honest, more than anything else, it's when someone has come from a different angle than I could even have imagined at any one point in my life, and said, well, what about this way of thinking? And it hasn't always stuck immediately, but it has kind of lodged there somewhere and made me at least think about it later. There's some kind of impact that is felt, whereby I remember, having been fairly, well, I'll come on to that a little bit in the second episode, I suppose, but, there exists the potential to change one's mind through questioning, based on new input that one couldn't even have imagined. So I would especially welcome angles that we don't touch on.
Right.
If anyone watching our conversation says, well, they're talking about this idea, but they didn't mention, and they don't even seem to have considered this, then I think that would be something that I would especially welcome and want to bring in somehow. Yeah,
and we'll be very responsive with whatever contact we receive. And I look forward to what's to come.
Cool.